Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Tonight, I join colleagues from both parties in focusing attention on what is surely one of the quietest and most avoided crises in America today. And I speak very directly of our federal budget, and in particular, its unsustainable, crippling federal deficit and debt. This silent but accelerating crisis threatens all of us, not only these generations, but generations into the future. This crisis is all of a fiscal crisis, an economic crisis, a social crisis, and a security crisis. You know, it's a crisis that we're frankly busy denying. We're certainly avoiding it and explaining it away. But I think we all know instinctively in this country, and some of us know very consciously in this country, that it is an imminent crisis. And tonight, colleagues of both parties and I, all of us members of our bipartisan Fiscal Forum, which has 87 bipartisan members of the House, who are committed to facing and solving this threat, want to discuss this issue in a very brief discussion to assure we do not keep sweeping this crisis under the rug. And we will highlight how our federal finances work, what's going wrong and why, what are the severe consequences if we don't correct the cause, and what can we do about it. And I will go into details later, but I first want to invite my colleagues to share some of their concerns and perspectives. I'd first like to recognize my colleague from Pennsylvania, Ms. Houlihan. Oh, I'm sorry, I will recognize Mr. Grothman. Are you good to go? I would like to recognize my colleague, Mr. Grothman from Wisconsin, a member of the Budget Committee, an accounting and fiscal management professional before your time in Congress, a member also of the Education and Oversight Committee, and somebody that knows his way around the budget. I recognize Mr. Grothman for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether the people back home realize how rare it is for a Democrat to be calling upon a Republican to speak about a bill. But it's a testament to the size of our fiscal crisis and the fact that we have a lot of very good bipartisan type legislators in this building. In any event, our national debt now stands at an astronomical $35 trillion. It's an unconsciously large debt, which is the result of decades of wasteful Washington spending, and it's a problem both parties have contributed to. To put it in historical perspective, as a share of our economy, the last time the debt was this high was the end of World War II. Last year, the federal government spent more than $6 trillion and racked up a deficit of $1.7 trillion, the third highest annual deficit in our country's history. One of the most frightening aspects of our out-of-control spending is the accelerating interest costs, which, of course, we can't reduce. So far in 2024, we spent $870 billion on interest costs. That's more than we spent on Medicare or the military, way more than we spend on the military. To illustrate how prolific the government is, let's take a look at how much of each year's spending was borrowed. 2018, 19 cents, 19, 22 cents, 2020, 48 cents, 2021, 40 cents, 2022, 22 cents, and 2023, 28 cents. We expect this trend to continue for at least the next 5 years. One cause of the red ink in recent years has been the use and abuse of emergency spending. The debt ceiling bill that was passed earlier this year set caps on discretionary spending. However, there's a loophole that allows certain spending to be designated as emergency spending and thus not subject to the cap. While there are some items that are genuine emergencies, too often Congress slaps the term emergency spending on projects it simply wants to fund despite the caps. Here are a few examples of federal spending that were labeled as emergency spending. $6.6 million for the replacement of irrigation systems at 2 golf courses in Colorado Springs. $12 million for the renovation of a minor league ballpark in New York State, and $70 million for tourism marketing in Puerto Rico. These emergency designations add up. Last year, Congress designated $162 billion in emergency spending. That's up from $108 This year, it's up to $196 billion. In fact, over the last 30 years, Congress has provided $12 trillion in emergency spending. I've been here for some of these, and I don't consider them emergencies. Or as soon as you slap emergency on them, it means you can spend with reckless abandon. Clearly, if we're going to tackle our debt and deficit problem, Congress will have to break its addiction to emergency spending. The culture of rampant emergency spending abuse is encouraged by the CBO's baseline budget. By law, the CBO is required to assume any spending Congress designates as emergency spending will continue on throughout the entire 10-year budget window and grow with inflation. Obviously reckless. Keep in mind, emergency spending is meant for one-time spending, not spending that goes on in perpetuity, but you never know that based on the way the CBO does these things. In fact, the most recent CBO baseline update demonstrates the need for this bill. In the June report, CBO raised the projected spending over the next 10 years by $945 billion. Nearly all this projected increase is due to $95 billion in supplemental foreign aid spending Congress passed earlier this year. Does it make sense for CBO to assume this temporary spending will continue for all 10 years? It's ridiculous on its face. To address this challenge, I'm pleased to work with Congressman Case of Hawaii to introduce the Stop the Baseline Bloat Act. This bill would amend the relevant law to ensure emergency spending is not included in CBO's baseline. Getting our fiscal house in order must start with a neutral baseline, and this bill will make a meaningful step towards fiscal sanity. For that reason, I am pleased that this bill will be marked up by the House Budget Committee tomorrow morning. I hope this common sense bill receives widespread bipartisan support. Thank you, Congressman Case, for your leadership in putting this bipartisan special order together and for leading the Stop the Baseline Bloat Act. I yield back.
Thank you so much to my colleague for highlighting not only the overall crisis, but certainly many of the process concerns that we all have in terms of full transparency, full accountability from the perspective of getting our budget under control. Thank you so much. I now would like to yield 5 minutes to my colleague, Representative Houlihan of Pennsylvania, an entrepreneur and a small business person herself, member of the Armed Services and Intelligence Committees, and somebody that also knows her way around the budget. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And I rise today with my colleagues as a very proud member of the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum Steering Committee. Together, we are very much committed to addressing one of the greatest threats to our nation's long-term stability, and that is that of our unsustainable debt trajectory. We also understand that we simply can't afford to treat our fiscal future like a political football. I represent Pennsylvania's 6th Congressional District, a very purple community where people understand that fiscal responsibility isn't a partisan issue, it's a community value. We know that our prosperity, both at home and across the country, depends on smart and responsible fiscal stewardship. Before coming to Congress, I was a business leader in Pennsylvania, and I've seen firsthand the risks and consequences of debt when it's not carefully managed. Businesses that ignore fiscal discipline may eventually falter. They may lose investors, may lose opportunities, or may even fail. And in the same way, if we continue on our current fiscal path as a nation, we could also find ourselves on similarly dangerous ground. Over the past few years, this nation, and consequently the federal government, has faced very costly and unprecedented challenges, from responding to the global pandemic, to defending our allies abroad from brutal, illegal attacks, to historic emergency national disasters. These crises have demanded investments and American leadership to protect our country and to support our global partners. However, as interest rates now dip and inflation lowers and eases, now is in fact the time to refocus our efforts. In the coming months, we must have serious conversations about the future of our long-term fiscal health. And as we look towards this future, the long-term implications of our national debt demand our attention and demand action. Right now, as has been mentioned, the U.S. national debt is over $35 trillion, larger than our entire economy's GDP. On a similar note, according to the Congressional Budget Office, if we fail to change course, interest payments on that debt alone are projected to exceed $1 trillion annually by 2033. $1 trillion just to pay the interest, money that could otherwise go towards infrastructure, families, education, and national security. And speaking of national security, I want to be clear. Our economic security is absolutely directly tied to our ability to defend ourselves and to lead on the global stage. The more that we borrow, the more we depend on foreign creditors, and the less flexibility that we have in making decisions that are in our national interest. And as our interest outlays increase, the less funding we have to spend on things like our military's preparedness. We cannot afford to have our hands tied by debt when it comes to protecting this nation. In Congress, we face critical deadlines in the coming months. As we prepare to vote on yet another short-term funding extension this week, we are reminded that a bipartisan full-year compromise for fiscal year 2025 government funding has yet to be reached. And early next year, we will once again face the debt ceiling. These are not abstract deadlines. These are real and pressing moments where we have the opportunity to together get control of our fiscal future. But that opportunity is slipping away if we continue to delay these difficult decisions and if we continue to politicize this issue. And so that's why the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum exists. We are here to sound the alarm and also to propose durable solutions like a bipartisan fiscal commission or the Fiscal Responsibility Act that we passed just last year. Our mission as a group is to raise the profile of this issue with our colleagues and with the public while ensuring that we have healthy, constructive debates on fiscal policies here in Congress. As a bipartisan group, we know that this is not about scoring political points. This is about securing a sustainable future for our children and for our grandchildren. We may not agree on every solution or on the levers to pull, increasing revenues or decreasing costs, but we cannot afford to continue to keep kicking the can down the road. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to please come together to set aside partisanship and to work towards a balanced, sustainable budget. We owe that to the American people. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank my colleague so much for her very realistic and eyes-wide-open assessment of our federal budget, and especially the focus on its impact on our national security from your own perspective in that space, because I think we sometimes forget that this is a security risk as well as a risk elsewhere. I now wish to recognize my colleague from Michigan, Representative Huizenga, the co-chair of our Bipartisan Fiscal Forum, a small business person himself in his prior life, Financial Services Committee, Foreign Affairs Committee, and a leader in this area. Mr. Huizenga, thank you for joining us. I recognize you for 5 minutes.
Hey, I appreciate it. And to my friend from Hawaii, this is a very important discussion to be having, not just among ourselves, but with the nation and with the country. And I want to start by saying thank you, not only for your sincere interest in this issue, but our growing friendship as well. And as I tell people back home, so often you need to have a relationship first to then be able to build trust. And when you build that trust, that's when you can go and find those solutions. And I'm sure you've got some constituents in Hawaii, much like I've got constituents over in Michigan, that sometimes say, "Why are you even talking to those people?" Right? Let's just ignore them. Well, sorry, folks, we can't do that. That's not reality. We have to deal with our colleagues, and guess what? We have gotten a very special group of people who have said, "Hey, look, we realize that we're not going to be able to solve every problem. We're not even going to try to solve every problem. But this is a growing issue and problem for us that we need to focus and concentrate on." And you are using this as an opportunity, the same as I will, to discuss some difficult truths with what we are facing and with what my constituents back in Southwest Michigan and yours in Hawaii, what we all are dealing with. And frankly, the size of our national debt is just climbing at an alarming rate. It now exceeds over $35 trillion, with a T, trillion dollars. Now, I probably like you and like a lot of our colleagues here, I go and I talk to kids at school. And I will oftentimes ask them, how many zeros in a trillion? And usually the first answer is a lot. It's yes, that's true. And I tell these kids, you know what you need to do at some point today? Write down a 1 with 12 zeros behind it. 12 zeros. But then don't start at the left, start at the right and see what $1,000 looks like, what $100,000 looks like, what $1 million, $10 million, $100 million, $1 billion looks like, and you still see all these zeros that you have to keep counting through. Well, that $35 trillion that we have spent here on the big giant credit card, Uncle Sam's credit card, is actually projected to reach closer to $57 trillion in the next 10 years. And there's consequences to that. There's consequences to that. And let's we could joke around and maybe understand that people aren't aware of what's going on. I've sort of had this running joke in our office that we need to put a giant debt clock up here in the House chambers to just remind people. But we have got to go out there and make sure that people understand that what is happening is this debt is crowding out other priorities. So much so that this year we are going to see, if projections hold true, we are going to see interest on the debt to exceed our military spending. Just think of that. Interest on the debt for what we've already spent is going to exceed what we are going to be spending, not just on the military, but also for every program that touches kids here in this country. Think about that. That is more than Medicare, more than military. We have got to get serious about this. And I think everybody can understand the concept of having a credit card that has maybe gotten a little too high. And they maybe feel like they've had to use it because of inflation and the things going on. But think about that. The interest on your credit card is now outpacing your grocery bill or outpacing your auto loan. How can you possibly function as a family? You can't. And we have to understand the debt that we have delivered here is driving some of that inflation. Interest rates that are there, the money that's getting taken away from other programs is real. And I'm the father of some college-age kids and small business owner, as you were kind enough to mention. My family's in construction. I'm a former realtor. I understand and talk to people on a regular basis what this means in their lives. And there is a real factor impacting you and my family and all of our constituents' families as well. So in addition to the debt threatening to bankrupt our nation's promises to seniors, to fueling inflation, causing interest payments, the national debt also slows economic growth. It drives up interest rates, leaves us less prepared for emergencies, whether it be a COVID-like emergency or whether it be a military-like emergency or whether it be a natural disaster emergency. Suddenly, these things could plunge our nation into even more chaos than what it would be normally because we are having these issues. And for these reasons, and with the help of many of our colleagues who are speaking tonight, I know Mr. Grothman spoke, Mr. Moore is going to be speaking, Ed, yourself, and so many others. We are really trying to tackle this with our bipartisan fiscal forum. And my co-chair, Scott Peters, has been a great partner in this. And he and I together introduced H.R. 5779, a Fiscal Commission Act, earlier. And that would force our Congress to tackle our national debt by voting on a package of policy recommendations designed to get our nation's fiscal house in order, both in the short term and in the long term. And as was quoted by Ms. Houlihan earlier, we're looking at real cuts in Social Security. We're looking at real cuts in Medicare. And those should not be acceptable if we've got to wrestle this dragon to the ground. So I'm proud that our legislation passed the House Budget Committee on a bipartisan basis, but we have a lot more work to do. And the purpose of tonight is to continuing to raise that awareness with a national audience, not just our colleagues, but our constituencies as well. And we've got to make sure that people understand crystal clear how serious this issue is and the real impacts it has making life less affordable and more difficult on our constituencies, not just in the short term, but certainly in the long run for our kids and our grandkids. So the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum, I know with your leadership and others, we stand ready to work with anybody. We will work with anybody that is interested in this, and has been stated, we may not always agree on the path, but we agree on the destination. And that is the important part, to make sure that we get to that destination, because it really is what we owe our kids and our grandkids and future generations of Americans. So appreciate the time to be with you and appreciate all of your work.
I appreciate my colleagues' leadership very much. And not only do we agree on the destination, but we agree on the problem. And when you can agree on what the problem is, you can usually get to a solution. What we need to do is all agree on that problem on a bipartisan basis.
Right.
Thank you very much. I now am pleased to yield 5 minutes to my colleague from Utah, Mr. Moore, a steering committee member of the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum, as well as a member of the Budget Committee and the Ways and Means Committee, and another small business person and somebody that also knows his way around a budget. Mr. Moore, I yield 5 minutes to you.
Thank you to the gentleman from Hawaii. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I rise alongside a bipartisan group of colleagues to discuss one of our nation's greatest threats. It is our nation's greatest threat: the unsustainable deficits and spiraling national debt. I would like to thank my friend Congressman Case for hosting this special order this evening and for his continued leadership on the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum. Today, our gross national debt exceeds $35 trillion. Our budget deficit is expected to reach $1.9 trillion this year, and spending on interest payments just to service our debt will surpass what we spend on Medicare and the national defense, each individually. This is a grave reality of our fiscal situation. As we all know, this is not an easy issue, and it is a problem created by both parties. Durable and lasting solutions will likewise require bipartisan partnership to address these difficult budgetary realities. I am grateful for groups like the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum, where members who recognize the catastrophic threat posed by our fiscal state come together to elevate this issue and find common sense solutions. As a father of 4 boys, this issue is deeply personal to me. I want my son's generation to have the same chance of the American dream that previous generations have had. Our national debt matters, and if we don't deal with it, our children and their children will bear the burden of higher inflation and interest costs, slower economic growth, and the national security risk associated with bloated federal government. Utah, my state, is a model for responsible budgeting and a balanced budget every year with a consistent rainy day fund. This is why, during my first term in Congress, I established a debt and deficit task force back home in Utah, comprised of leaders from across the state, to create a framework of solutions for how elected officials should address our nation's debt crisis with Utah's fiscally responsible values. The 4 main pillars of our framework include growing the economy, saving and strengthening vital programs, focusing America's spending, and fixing Congress's budget process. I know that several of my colleagues involved in the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum have recognized many of the same structural issues and are working hard to change the tide here in Washington. As a member of the Budget Committee, I have been proud of the work we have done in Congress this Congress to raise the profile of our national debt and deficit crisis. Earlier this year, the committee passed my Fiscal State of the Nation Act, which would require the nonpartisan Comptroller General to provide an annual update on the nation's finances to join a meeting of Congress and help the nation understand the scope of the problem. I applaud Chairman Jody Arrington for leading the charge on a lot of important legislation and conversations that are making the dangers of our federal debt crisis feel more real to the American people. The committee also advanced a very important and significant Bipartisan Fiscal Commission Act, crucial legislation led by Congressman Huizenga from Michigan and Congressman Peters from California. The bill would establish a commission tasked with identifying policies to improve the fiscal situation in the medium term and attain a sustainable debt-to-GDP ratio over the longer term. The commission would operate in an open and transparent manner, and importantly, it provides for expedited consideration on the House and Senate floor. That's something we haven't always had in these similar types of approaches, is that there would be expedited consideration to force a House and Senate floor vote. While establishing a fiscal commission is critical in the short term, I know many of my colleagues would agree that we need to reform our budget process to help make sustainable budgeting possible. To illustrate the scope of the budget process challenges, here are a few figures. Congress has not adopted a budget on time since 2003. Congress has not passed all appropriations on time since 1996. And the only time Congress has passed both budget resolution and appropriations by the deadline It was 1977. The Budget Committee is working hard on budget process reform, and I know members of the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum have ideas to revamp the process as well. A bipartisan bill I introduced with Congresswoman Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez to tackle this problem is the Comprehensive Congressional Budget Act, which would take the next step toward an effective and inclusive congressional budgeting process by including all spending and revenue in the budget process and requiring contributions from committees with direct spending or revenue jurisdiction. I emphasize all spending because as I listed off things where we've fallen short over the last 50 years, it's not even highlighting the most important aspect. We don't vote on more than 75% of our budget. We all, 435 of us, 100 senators, we're responsible in our Article 1 duty for our federal budget. And we vote on approximately 23% of that. This Comprehensive Congressional Budget Act would force Congress to take into consideration the entirety of the budget. And it would give the committees the right responsibility, and it would make the process that we would have to address, we would have to roll up our sleeves, and we would actually have to deal with the entirety of the budget. Because of the fact that we just vote on appropriations bills doesn't solve a single thing. Next year will be an important year as we deal with major fiscal cliffs. Beyond the annual appropriations process, we will have to deal with the reinstatement of the debt limit in addition to trillions of dollars of tax expirations that will affect every American family. Groups like the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum are incredibly valuable as we take on the challenges and opportunities ahead of us in 2025. I look forward to continuing this important work, and I yield back to Mr. Case.
Thank you so much to my colleague for your leadership as well, and I really appreciate your highlighting the intergenerational consequences of not solving this issue today. May I inquire how much time I have left?
The gentleman has about 20 minutes. 20 minutes.
Oh, 20 minutes. Okay. Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate my colleagues spending the time here tonight. And now what I'd like to do is to go back and add a little bit of detail so that we can fully illustrate what the issue is, how we got here, what the consequences are, and why we need to do it, and something about it, and how we do so. So the first thing I'd like to start with is something very, very basic, and that is, how do our federal finances actually work? And the first and foremost thing to say here is that our federal finances are no different in concept than our family or business budgets fundamentally. In our federal finance situation, our taxes and our fees create revenues for our government. Our programs create the expenses for our government. And if the revenues exceed expenses, we call that a surplus. And if expenses exceed revenues, that's a deficit. And we calculate both revenues and expenses and surpluses and deficits on an annual fiscal year. So when we're talking about a deficit or a surplus, we're talking about what happened in a particular fiscal year. Now, how do we address a deficit if we have it? It's easy to understand how we deal with a surplus. We spend the money that we got, and we hopefully save up a little bit for the next year, just like any family, any business. But what do we do about deficits? Well, we borrow that money. And we mostly borrow it by issuing government bonds to people around the country and world who want to invest in our government bonds, believing that the United States is the most secure investment in the entire world. But we also borrow intergovernment, or more accurately, intragovernment. We are busy borrowing, for example, from the Social Security Trust Fund, which is building up a surplus towards a time when it needs it far more to pay Social Security benefits, and that money is due and owable to the Social Security Trust Fund. So this creates an extra pressure on the Social Security Trust Fund. That money is not being used for Social Security, it's being used for everything but Social Security. So those borrowings which in a family or a business setting could be handled, start to overwhelm you. And we, of course, like anybody else, pay interest on what we have borrowed. And our total borrowings at any one time, which are essentially the accumulation of our deficits over time, are our total government debt. Now, just like any family or business, it'd be nice to have no deficit or debt, but that's not most of us. And it's fine to run some debt if that debt is not chronic, and if that debt is not just an excuse to be irresponsible and avoid fiscally responsible behavior, and that debt is not too high in relationship to our overall budget or economy. We measure this many times by reference to our gross domestic product, how much our economy is producing, and we calculate a debt to GDP ratio, which if it's too high starts to overwhelm the economy, just like any family or business budget. And further, if the interest on the debt is not too high in relation to our total budget. So bottom line, we can afford some debt, but not if it starts to get away from us. And this is, again, no different in concept than a family or a business budget, with one exception. And that is, we can go on borrowing as long as we want, even irresponsible borrowing, whereas in a family and a business budget, that's going to catch up with you sooner or later. Now, what exactly is going wrong, and why is it going wrong? Well, the last year that we had a surplus in our federal budget was 2001, 23 years ago. We have run deficits every year since then. We have This illustrates our deficit track since 2001, down on this side. And you can see that it increased in the middle part of the 08, 09, 10, 11, during the Great Recession, when we had higher expenditures for recovery and lower revenues because we were in a recession. And then, of course, this big bump right here is COVID, when we had to borrow a lot of money, when we had to run deficits in order to bail our country out of a tremendous problem. These 2 years were deficits. And then we recovered in a post-COVID environment, but now we see it going up again for no real good reason other than that we're running deficits. We're now at $1.9 trillion per year, and if we carry that out over time, we will see deficits grow to about $2.9 trillion by 2034, just not too many years away. How about our debt? This is our total debt, and it starts over on the left side back in 1990, and we had a pretty level debt increase until the early part of the 00s. The last time we had a surplus, we were managing debt, and then it started to take off with that recession, and it started to take off more with irresponsible budgetarily decisions on revenues and expenses. And the scariest part is the acceleration of this curve right here, which takes us only to about 2022. Our debt was $7 trillion in 2004, $18 trillion in 2014, $23 trillion in 2019, and now, as was already noted, it is up to $35 trillion. 23 trillion to 35 trillion in 5 years. Okay, how about the measure of debt to GDP? As was discussed earlier, that's a really good indication of what's actually happening in your economy. And this is our debt to GDP. Now, you can see this big bulge right here was the highest debt to GDP we've had to date, and that was World War II, when we had to borrow to win a war. We had to do that. And of course, the war, aside from being tragic, was not very good for the world economy. And so we had a real issue, as we always do in a war. This happens from a budget perspective. But here we see a rapid escalation in debt to GDP in the last 5-7 years. This number right here is about 125%, or 24%, which is our highest level of debt to GDP since World War II. And unless corrected, this is what's going to happen. It will shoot up over the next 10 years. Reference was made by my colleagues earlier to interest that we pay every year on our current national debt. Our annual interest on debt now is up to $892 billion. And as was mentioned by reference, that is more today than we spend on defense or Medicare. This line is interest, this red line right here. This line is defense, extrapolated at the current levels out to 2034 from today, which is right over here. And by the way, we all know that we need a very robust defense expenditure to handle the geopolitical challenges that we face. The green line is Medicare. The point here is, unless we get interest under control, it will essentially surpass defense, continue at an increasing gap. Medicare is going up because it's costing more. It's staying up with Medicare, and it is essentially overwhelming our ability to pay for defense and Medicare, crowding out our national budget. Now, what are the consequences of carrying a very high deficit and very high debt load? Why does debt matter, in so many words? Well, I'm going to go through this pretty fast. Number one, I already said it. It crowds out other needed spending, defense and non-defense. It reduces fiscal flexibility, especially in crises. What if we did have another COVID today, tomorrow? What if we had a major expense that we didn't anticipate? Our debt and deficits would jack up, just as happened during COVID, just as we saw during the Second World War. The interest rates would jack up essentially exactly when we needed to have a fiscally solvent and responsible base to build on. In other words, you have to prepare for crises. When you're not in a crisis, that's the time to get your thoughts in order. And when you go there, that's when you want the flexibility. It slows economic growth. It creates inflation pressure. It creates interest rate pressure. We've already talked about national security risks, especially with adversaries such as the People's Republic of China, who invest in our bonds. China owns a tremendous amount of our bonds. That gives China leverage over us. I don't want to be a borrower from China. It disincentivizes responsible budgeting internationally. Many countries around the world are facing budgetary pressures. And if we can't run our own show, how can we ask them to run their own show responsibly? And finally, it feeds directly into arguments by the PRC and others that are seeking to replace our dollar as the world's reserve currency. Essentially, what they are saying is the dollar is not a stable, not a responsible, not a secure currency, and let's try our own. We are begging all of these questions right now. So, what do we do about all of this? There's a couple of things we can do. First of all, we can acknowledge the issue, and we can acknowledge the crisis, and we can acknowledge that we have something that we must work on. Number one, stop looking for marginal, illusory magic solutions. For those that say we can grow our way out of this, no, we can't. We would have to have an annual growth rate of somewhere around the range of 10%, which is absolutely unrealistic, a year for the foreseeable future for us to solve this simply by growing this economy. Any economist would say that we were doing incredibly well to come even close to 10% a year. We can also stop the bleeding and reduce annual deficits through mechanisms such as PAYGO, which is a responsible process that we have followed sometimes and lately not followed, under which whenever we reduce revenues through tax reductions, we have to offset them with expenses or revenues somewhere else, or vice versa. Whenever we increase a program cost, we have to pay for it, or else reduce another program cost so that it is budget neutral. We obviously need to rebalance revenue and expense over time in our tax and spending policies with major decisions coming up. And finally, as was mentioned, we probably need some major help with a fiscal commission. A fiscal commission can help us to sort through this in a nonpartisan, apolitical way, to provide the expertise necessary to make recommendations that we must take a look at. And to those that criticize fiscal commissions, I would pose the question, well, what's your solution then? Is there a solution that you have that you think would help us to solve this incredible crisis? And so in conclusion, for the Bipartisan Fiscal Forum, my 87 colleagues and others who believe that this is indeed a crisis, we have got a couple of steps that we have to go through. The first step is to stop the denial, which is where we are right now. For this to be an issue in our campaigns, in our elections, for this to be front and center in our public discourse, then we have to ask, what can we do? And there's plenty we can do. First of all, we can get through denial and get firmly into step number 2, which is to do something about it. And then next, of course, acknowledge that the solutions are hard, but the alternative of doing nothing is and will be far, far harder. We urge acknowledgement and action, both within our Congress, our colleagues in Congress, and especially with you, the American people, as you consider this crisis. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.